You may sit with me for a moment before we begin, because what we are about to enter is not merely an intellectual exploration, but a descent into the architecture of your inner world. I want you to feel how the air shifts when we speak of the mother and the father, not as people, but as the primordial currents that shape the earliest chambers of your psyche. There is always a soft trembling that rises when these words are invoked. Even the strongest among you feel it. For in the end, nothing touches the core of a human being more deeply than the emotional imprint left by the two beings who stood closest to the gates of your becoming. And you, if you are the rare empath who carries both wounds, both reflections, both shadows, then your journey is of a different order. Those who carry only one wound often learn to limp with a kind of compensatory strength, but those who carry both, like two mirrors turned inward, generating infinite reflections, must learn to walk through a far more intricate labyrinth. Your sensitivity was not simply a temperament. It was a survival strategy forged in a home where the emotional climate was unstable, unpredictable, or energetically charged in ways a child could not decode. You learned to feel every shift in tone, every unspoken tension, every shadow crossing a face. You learned to become the emotional barometer of the household, not because you were fragile, but because you were the only one awake enough to perceive the psychic currents flowing beneath the surface. And now, later in life, as you stand on the path of healing, you begin to sense something extraordinary emerging. You begin to understand that the empath who heals only one wound may regain balance, but the empath who heals mother and father fully, deeply, archetypally, becomes something else entirely psychologically untouchable, not invulnerable in the cold sense of being unreachable, but untouchable in the sense that nothing external can penetrate the inner sovereignty you reclaim. Because once you have walked through the origins of your fragmentation, you are no longer afraid of any external projection, manipulation, or distortion. You have already met the earliest gods and demons of your psyche. Nothing out there is more powerful than what you have already faced within. Let us speak quietly now about the mother. The mother as an archetype is not merely the woman who gave you life. She is the first container of existence, the first atmosphere, the first emotional language, the first mirror of worth. If your mother carried her own wounds, her own unprocessed shadow, then you absorbed them long before you had the words to understand what they were. You learned to interpret her silence as disapproval, her sadness as a flaw in yourself, her chaos as your responsibility. Many empaths were not simply born sensitive. They were conditioned into sensitivity by mothers whose inner world was a storm. The child constantly tried to calm, and yet, paradoxically, it is the mother wound that first awakens the intuitive dimension of the empath. The child who must feel for the mother learns the earliest form of symbolic language, the ability to sense the invisible, to perceive the emotional aura of a room, to translate subtle expressions into meaning. What adults later call intuition was simply your first language. But the price of this language was high. You never learned to place your emotional needs at the center of your own life. You lived orbiting another person's inner world, trying to stabilize what you never created. The father wound is different. If the mother wound affects your sense of worth, the father wound affects your sense of direction. The mother tells you whether you deserve love. The father tells you whether the world is safe to walk into. When the father is absent, emotionally distant, unpredictable, or wounded in his own masculinity, the empath learns to fear assertion, visibility, and self-expression. The father wound is a fracture in the spine of the psyche. It creates a split between who you are and who you believe you are allowed to become. Many empaths grow up with an invisible chain around the throat, not a literal one, but a psychic inhibition that whispers, "Do not take up too much space. Do not shine too brightly. Do not disturb what others need from you." And so, the empath, raised by an unhealed mother and a distant or wounded father, grows into an adult carrying two contradictory but equally powerful internal narratives. The mother wound whispers, "You must earn love." The father wound whispers, "You must fear becoming yourself." And these two wounds together generate what I call the empath's double bind, a state in which the self is simultaneously yearning and suppressed, intuitive yet restrained, powerful yet inhibited. It is this double bind that makes the rare empath so unique. For the empath who heals only the mother wound learns to receive love but may still fear stepping into their full authority. The empath who heals only the father wound learns to assert themselves, but may still draw partners or friends who mirror the mother's emotional chaos. But the empath who heals both wounds, both archetypes, breaks free from the roots of all internal contradiction. This is why such a person becomes psychologically untouchable. Feel into that phrase for a moment. Untouchable does not mean indifferent or armored. It means you are no longer governed by the unconscious contracts written in childhood. It means the energies that once shaped your life no longer guide your choices through fear or longing. It means you have differentiated your adult self from the imprints of your younger self. The past no longer speaks through your behavior. To reach this state, one must pass through several thresholds, each one a kind of inner initiation. Let me take you into the first threshold, the recognition of inherited emotional patterns. For many empaths, the first moment of awakening is not a moment of clarity, but a moment of collapse. Suddenly, the life they have built begins to crumble, or relationships fall apart, or their body begins to manifest symptoms of long repressed emotional tension. They ask themselves, why does this keep happening? Why do I attract the same dynamics? Why do I repeat the same wounds? And the answer is never a superficial behavioral habit. It is always an inherited pattern lodged in the unconscious, shaped by the emotional architecture of the family. The empath must face the realization that they have been reliving the mother's unlived life or carrying the father's unspoken suffering. Healing begins when the empath stops being the unconscious vessel of generational pain and becomes instead the conscious witness of it. This shift alone changes destinies. The second threshold is shadow confrontation. Every empath, no matter how gentle or compassionate, carries a shadow that is proportionate to their sensitivity. The shadow of the empath is not aggression or cruelty. As some might imagine, it is suppressed anger, suppressed boundaries, suppressed desire, suppressed individuality. The empath believes they are good because they feel deeply, but the truth is more complex. The empath's shadow is often a reservoir of unspoken rage accumulated from years of emotional labor that was never acknowledged. It is the rage of being unseen, unheard, and unprotected. It is a rage of carrying responsibilities that were not theirs to carry. Until this shadow is integrated, the empath remains vulnerable to manipulation, self-sacrifice, and emotional enmeshment. Healing requires the empath to reclaim the parts of themselves they pushed into darkness. This is why the journey feels so unsettling. The empath must learn to say no with the authority of someone who has been silent for too long. They must learn to disappoint others without collapsing into guilt. They must learn to become a steward of their own energy rather than a perpetual caretaker of the emotional needs around them. These acts feel almost violent to someone raised in emotional servitude, yet they are sacred acts of liberation. The third threshold is archetypal reconciliation. This is where the work moves beyond personal memory into the realm of symbols, dreams, and inherited psychic structures. The mother and father archetypes exist independently of your biological parents. They are universal patterns of energy, nourishment, and structure, love and authority, receptivity and direction. When these archetypes are wounded within you, they distort your relationships, your identity, and your relationship with the world. But when they are healed, you become aligned with the deeper rhythms of life. You no longer seek partners to fill parental voids. You no longer fear your own ambitions. You no longer confuse intensity with love or sacrifice with loyalty. You move from compensating to creating, from reacting to becoming. Healing both archetypes restores symmetry to the psyche, and symmetry is power. I will pause here for a breath, but not a break. Let the words sink into the deeper fabric of your awareness. Let the symbolic truths move through you like currents of warm air rising from ancient waters. Now that we have entered the first layers of the mother and father wounds, we must descend deeper into the symbolic, the dreamlike, the primordial terrain where these wounds first took shape. For the rare empath, the healing journey does not unfold merely on the level of memory or intellect. It unfolds in the landscape of the unconscious, where images and emotions create the architecture of one's destiny long before consciousness awakens. Let us begin with a dream I have seen in countless variations across the lives of empaths, especially those who carry both wounds. In the dream, a child stands at the edge of a forest at dusk. The sky is neither day nor night, but the strange in-between hour where shadows lengthen and the world holds its breath. The child senses a presence in the woods, both familiar and unsettling. and feels compelled to enter. The trees whisper, the ground softens underfoot, and the deeper the child walks, the more the forest seems to come alive with memory. Finally, at a small clearing, two figures appear, one clothed in light, one in shadow. The child understands, without anyone speaking, that the two figures are mother and father, not as people but as living forces. One extends a hand but with trembling uncertainty. The other stands strong but distant. The child is torn. This dream is not fiction, it is a symbolic map of the empath's early psyche. The forest is the unconscious. The twilight is the emotional ambiguity of childhood. The two figures represent the archetypal imbalances. The mother whose love was inconsistent. The father whose presence was unpredictable. The child's feeling of being torn is the origin of the empath's lifelong internal conflict. To choose connection or safety, belonging or individuality, merging or freedom. And yet, something remarkable happens in the dream. The child eventually realizes that neither figure can lead them out of the forest. The path forward opens only when the child steps between them, not toward one or the other, but into the center. This moment symbolizes the empath's awakening. The healing path requires not choosing one parent over the other, but integrating both energies within oneself. Only then does the forest release the child. Only then does the dream end. This dream carries a profound truth. Healing is not about changing the past. It is about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were divided by it. Let us speak now of the mother archetype once more. But at a deeper layer, in many empaths, the mother wound manifests as an internalized voice of self-doubt, quiet, persistent, pervasive. It says, you must earn affection. It says, your needs are too much. It says, if you are too loud, too sad, too angry, too different, you will lose love. These messages were not always spoken aloud. They were absorbed like moisture in the air. The empath learned to moderate themselves, to shrink their presence, to silence their feelings. But what you must understand is that these adaptations were intelligent. They were strategies of survival, formed in an environment where emotional safety was inconsistent or conditional. To heal the mother wound, the empath must break the unconscious loyalty to the mother's unprocessed pain. This does not mean rejecting the mother. It means refusing to carry what never belonged to you. You must release the inherited belief that your worthiness is contingent upon pleasing others, fixing others, understanding others more deeply than they understand you. The rare empath who heals the mother wound stops performing emotional labor that was once automatic. They begin to ask, what do I feel? What do I need? What is mine? And what is not? And the moment they begin to ask these questions, the old dynamics that once controlled them begin to lose their grip. Now let us turn to the father wound again, for it runs even deeper than many realize. If the mother wound shapes your emotional identity, the father wound shapes your existential identity. A child looks to the father, consciously or unconsciously, to understand whether the world is a place where they are allowed to manifest fully. If the father was distant, critical, withdrawn, or wounded in his own fatherhood, the empath internalizes insecurity around stepping into their potential. They become afraid of ambition, afraid of visibility, afraid of taking up space. They may unconsciously sabotage their success to maintain a sense of psychological safety. They become drawn to relationships where they remain small. Because smallness feels familiar, healing the father wound involves reclaiming your authority over your own life. It means learning to occupy your full stature without fear. It means breaking the internal conditioning that whispers, do not rise too high, do not shine too brightly, do not upset the balance. The healed empath steps into their power with a calm inevitability, as though they are finally aligning with the trajectory that was always meant for them. They stop asking for permission to exist. They stop hesitating. They stop deferring their destiny. The rare empath who heals both wounds becomes psychologically untouchable because they are no longer governed by the unconscious patterns of childhood. They are no longer triggered by the same dynamics. They no longer fall into relationships that mirror their early imbalances. They can see manipulation before it reaches them. They can sense emotional dishonesty in its earliest form. They are anchored in themselves, and this anchoring creates an aura of quiet power. But power alone is not what makes them untouchable. What makes them truly untouchable is the synthesis of love and authority within their psyche. Once the mother archetype is healed, the empath embodies deep self-compassion, intuition, and emotional richness. Once the father archetype is healed, the empath embodies clarity, boundary, and direction. When these two energies merge, they become a force of psychic symmetry, a balanced self capable of navigating the world without being pulled into emotional entanglements or psychological traps. Let us move more deeply into the symbolic dimension, for the unconscious speaks in images long before it speaks in words. In another common dream among empaths, a house appears with two locked rooms, one associated with the mother, one with the father. The dreamer wanders the hallways, sensing that something unresolved lies behind each door, but they are afraid to open them. Often, the dream repeats for years until one night, without warning, one of the doors opens. The room behind it may be chaotic or empty, bright or dim, but the important thing is that it has been entered. Once the dreamer enters one room, the other door eventually opens too. This dream marks a turning point. The locked rooms represent repressed emotions, unexamined memories, inherited beliefs. To open them is to confront what the psyche has avoided. But once the rooms are explored, they lose their power. The dreamer becomes master of the house rather than a guest in it. The empath becomes sovereign, and sovereignty is what makes the healed empath untouchable. Sovereignty is the ability to hold your emotional center regardless of external pressures. It is the ability to witness your triggers without collapsing into them. It is the ability to navigate relationships without losing yourself. It is the ability to love without returning to childhood roles. It is the ability to choose your path rather than repeat the path laid out by your parents' unresolved pain. Let me share with you a symbolic truth. The psyche heals not by erasing the past, but by integrating it. The wounds do not disappear. They become part of your structure, like the rings of a tree that record every winter it has survived. The healed empath carries their history not as a burden but as a map. Every sorrow becomes a source of clarity. Every fragmentation becomes a portal to deeper unity. Every shadow becomes a guide. The final stage of this inner transformation is what I call archetypal alignment. It is the moment when the mother and father energies within you stop competing and start cooperating. You begin to feel a sense of inner coherence, an inner harmony that was missing for years. You no longer feel pulled in opposite directions between pleasing and becoming, between merging and separating, between longing and protecting. Instead, you feel a calm that radiates from the core of your being. This calm is not emptiness, it is fullness. It is a fullness that arises when the psyche stands whole. This state is rare. It is what makes the healed empath so powerful. They move through the world with a clarity that others sense immediately, even if they cannot explain it. Manipulative people avoid them instinctively. Emotionally chaotic people cannot anchor themselves in them. Unavailable partners lose their allure completely. The healed empath becomes a mirror that reflects truth so cleanly that any distortion becomes impossible to maintain. Take a breath with me now, for we have descended far into the depths of your inner architecture. In the next part, we will explore how the healed empath begins to rewrite their destiny, how relationships shift, how boundaries become effortless, how intuition sharpens, and how psychological untouchability becomes a lived reality in daily life. As we continue, I want you to imagine that you and I are no longer sitting in a room, but standing inside your own psyche, its corridors, its long forgotten rooms, its dim staircases leading downward into chambers lit only by the soft glow of memory. For the rare empath, transformation does not occur in the brightly lit spaces of external life. It occurs in these inner rooms, where the residue of childhood still clings to the walls like old shadows. You must understand something profoundly. An empath's sensitivity is not merely emotional, it is architectural. It shapes how your psyche builds itself. Where others develop thick exterior walls, empaths build windows openings through which the energies of others flow in and out. This is why the wounds of the mother and father engrave themselves so strongly into your early foundations. But once those wounds are healed, the same architecture becomes your greatest strength. The windows become gateways to intuition rather than vulnerabilities to intrusion. Let us speak now about the moment this transformation begins to crystallize. The moment when the mother and father archetypes within you stop acting as ghosts and begin acting as allies. This integration is not a mental decision. It is an inner awakening that unfolds slowly. Like dawn breaking over a quiet lake, you begin to notice subtle shifts in yourself. You notice, for example, that the emotional storms that once destabilized you now barely graze your inner landscape. You respond rather than react. You observe rather than absorb. You begin to feel that your emotional system is no longer porous. This is what I call psychic coherence. It is the first sign that the empath is moving into the realm of being psychologically untouchable. You stop looking for a mother in the world. You stop looking for a father in the world. You stop seeking outside what you have been cultivating inside. The inner mother gives you self-compassion. The inner father gives you direction. And together, they give you a sense of internal belonging you never had as a child. This inner belonging is rare. It is the root of your new untouchability. Let me show you how this shift begins to transform your relationships. For an empath, healing the dual wounds does not result in becoming cold or distant. Rather, it creates a new kind of clarity before healing. Relationships often feel like a maze filled with projections, ancient echoes, unresolved longing, and hidden fears. After healing, the maze becomes a straight corridor. You see the dynamic for what it is without confusion. What once felt like destiny now feels like pattern. What once felt like love now reveals itself as emotional repetition. What once felt irresistible now becomes irrelevant. In this clarity, the empath becomes unmanipulable. Not because they resist manipulation, but because manipulation no longer hooks into any unhealed wound. There is nothing left inside that resonates with psychological traps. The old code has been rewritten. People who once held power over your emotional world suddenly feel small, almost ghost-like. You see the fractures in their intentions. You sense the truth behind their tone. You feel the emotional texture of their words and immediately understand whether it is genuine or performative. This is not cynicism. It is vision, emotional vision. The vision that emerges only after you have walked through your own shadows and are no longer afraid of darkness. Because you have discovered that darkness was never your enemy. It was your birthplace. Let us go deeper. The rare empath who heals mother and father experiences a profound shift in their personal energy field. It becomes denser, more grounded, more stable. People feel the difference instantly. They may not know what has changed, but they sense that entering your emotional space now requires authenticity. Anything less dissolves at the threshold. You stop attracting the emotionally unavailable, the chaotic, the narcissistic, the wounded who feed on caretakers. Your resonance no longer matches theirs. The phenomenon is simple. The healed empath stops speaking the emotional language that once called these people forth. When the mother wound is unhealed, you radiate a frequency that says, I will overgive, I will soothe, I will understand you more than you understand me. And so, you attract those who take but do not reciprocate. When the father wound is unhealed, you radiate a frequency that says, I doubt myself, I fear stepping into my power. And so, you attract those who sense this hesitation and unconsciously dominate or eclipse you. But when both wounds are healed, the frequencies dissolve. In their place, a new signal emerges. I am whole, not perfect, whole. This wholeness frightens some people. It confuses others, but it draws to you those who are capable of meeting you soul to soul rather than wound to wound. Let me take you to another symbolic landscape to understand this shift. Imagine an ancient temple with two pillars at its entrance. One pillar is inscribed with the symbols of the mother water, moon, earth, night, intuition. The other is inscribed with the symbols of the father sun, fire, sky, clarity, direction. Most people live their entire lives leaning heavily on one pillar while neglecting the other. The empath, wounded by both parents, cannot lean on either. Both pillars were unstable in childhood. So the empath learns to stand in the middle, unsupported, balancing themselves in ways no one ever taught them. It feels like loneliness at first, but as healing progresses, that center point becomes a throne. The empath becomes the bridge between the two pillars rather than the shadow cast beneath them. This is the inner throne of the healed empath, the psychological seat from which they observe their life without fear of collapse. And from this throne, relationships transform entirely. The healed empath no longer confuses intensity with connection. They no longer interpret suffering as devotion. They no longer play the role of healer, savior, or emotional anchor unless consciously chosen. They begin to prefer relationships that feel peaceful rather than dramatic. They choose partners who are emotionally responsible rather than compelling. They seek depth, not chaos, reciprocity, not magnetism, truth, not projection. This is why the healed empath becomes unreachable to broken love. It is not that they refuse it. It is that their energy no longer recognizes it as love. Let me take you into the mechanics of this transformation at a psychological level. When the mother wound heals, self-worth stabilizes. When the father wound heals, self-trust stabilizes. And when both stabilize together, the empath's boundaries become organic, not forced, not rigid, not reactive, organic. An organic boundary is not something you declare, it is something you are. People sense it, they feel the energetic perimeter around you and instinctively understand where they can and cannot step. You no longer have to explain yourself. You no longer have to justify your choices. You no longer have to defend your emotions. Your presence speaks for you. This is psychological untouchability. It is not created by strength of will, but by integration of inner archetypes. Once the union of mother and father energies is restored, the psyche stands complete. And a complete psyche is not easily penetrable. It no longer leaks energy. It no longer seeks external validation. It no longer trembles at the possibility of abandonment. The healed empath has walked through abandonment and emerged with belonging, real belonging, internal belonging. There is one more layer we must touch before we close this part, the empath's new relationship with their own shadow. When both wounds are healed, the shadow softens. It is no longer a threat. It becomes a companion, a guide, a reservoir of strength. The healed empath no longer fears their dark emotions. They no longer suppress anger, longing, desire, or grief. These emotions become teachers rather than burdens. And in this new relationship with the shadow, another gift emerges: self-forgiveness. For the first time, the empath begins to forgive their younger self, not for being weak, but for being so incredibly strong in ways no one recognized. They see the child not as damaged but as heroic. They see their past not as failure but as initiation. And once this self-forgiveness takes root, the empath becomes light in a way that is unmistakable, not fragile light, but luminous gravity. The room bends toward them. The air around them becomes still. People speak differently in their presence, not because they demand respect, but because their clarity, their coherence, their integration silently commands it. As we continue our descent and ascent into your inner world, I want you to feel how different the air has become around you since we first began. Something subtle has shifted, not because of the words themselves, but because your psyche has been remembering the forgotten rooms, the early imprints, the ancient tensions, remembering the child who stood between the mother and the father, torn by forces too large to name, and remembering, most of all, the deep truth that everything you believed had broken you was actually shaping you for a destiny of uncommon psychological strength. The empath who heals only one wound becomes balanced. The empath who heals neither becomes lost, but the empath who heals both becomes reborn. Let us enter this rebirth now. There comes a moment in the rare empath's journey that feels almost anticlimactic, and yet it is the precise moment everything changes. It is not dramatic. It is not a revelation accompanied by thunder. It is a quiet recognition. I no longer need what I once chased. I no longer fear what once controlled me. This is the moment of emancipation from the past. Let me paint the scene. An empath sits alone, perhaps in a quiet morning light, perhaps after the end of a relationship or a conversation that did not go as expected, but instead of collapsing into familiar patterns, self-blame, over-analysis, emotional overextension, they feel something new, a stillness, a clarity, the sense that nothing external is defining their emotional state. They feel grounded, spacious, whole. This moment marks a crossing from wounded empathy into sovereign empathy. Sovereign empathy is empathy that no longer bleeds, it no longer drains, it no longer seeks permission to exist, it no longer merges with the needs of others by reflex, it feels deeply without losing shape, it witnesses without absorbing, it loves without abandoning itself. This is psychological untouchability, but you must understand, untouchability does not mean the absence of emotion. It does not mean stoicism or detachment. It means you have gained mastery over the inner levers of your psyche. It means your emotional responses are now rooted in awareness rather than pattern. It means you are no longer living from the child within, but from the integrated adult who has walked through the fires of their own unconscious. Let us examine this transformation from the symbolic perspective of the self. In Jungian psychology, the self is the organizing principle of the entire psyche, the inner intelligence guiding you toward wholeness. It is the archetype of completion, harmony, and destiny. Most people touch the self only briefly through a dream, a crisis, a spiritual moment, yet spend decades avoiding its call. But empaths, especially those who carry both wounds, are strangely intimate with the self even before they understand what it is. Their sensitivity is the echo of the self's insistence on depth. Their longing for repair is a self urging them toward integration. Their early suffering is the self preparing them for a level of consciousness few people reach. When the mother and father wounds are healed, the self rises to the center. You can feel it as an inner alignment that is unmistakable. It is like a sun dawning inside the ribcage. The psyche orients around it effortlessly. Decisions that once produced anxiety now feel guided. Boundaries that once felt impossible now feel natural. Relationships that once felt magnetic now feel misaligned. The self becomes your North Star, and your life begins to reorganize itself around this inner axis. This reorganization is not always comfortable at first. When you stop repeating old patterns, the people who benefited from your wounds fall away. When you stop offering emotional labor for free, those who once depended on your energy become frustrated. When you stop shrinking, those who preferred you small become confused. But this shedding process is sacred. It is the skin your soul has outgrown. The rare empath must learn that losing certain people is not a failure, it is a recalibration of destiny. Let us turn now to the most profound aspect of untouchability, the empath's new relationship with love. Before healing, the empath's relationships often form around unconscious wounds. The mother wound attracts partners who require care. The father wound attracts partners who withhold affection or approval. Together, these create a cycle of longing, overgiving, and depletion. But after healing, the empath begins to experience love differently. It no longer feels like yearning, it feels like recognition. It no longer feels like sacrifice, it feels like reciprocity. It no longer feels like performing, it feels like being. And here lies the transformation. The healed empath becomes impossible to manipulate because they are no longer seeking emotional permission from anyone. They no longer chase. They no longer plead. They no longer explain their pain to be understood. They no longer tolerate ambiguity disguised as affection. Their standards become quiet but immovable. And those who once fed on their openness suddenly find no place to latch onto. Imagine a lake. Before healing, the lake is turbulent, reactive to every gust of wind, every disturbance on the surface. After healing, the same lake becomes still. It does not freeze, it becomes reflective. Anyone who approaches it is forced to see themselves clearly. This is the aura of the healed empath. They reflect truth. Nothing hides in their presence, and those who fear truth cannot stay long. Let us go deeper still. The rare empath who heals both wounds develops what I can only call inner father energy and inner mother energy, working together in harmony. The inner mother says, I will not abandon myself again. The inner father says, I will step into the world without fear. Together